Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly news, a weekly look at news from around the world. Joining us this week from New York City, Peter Spiegel, the U.S. editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to have you back.
Good to be back, Ivo.
And from Berlin, Stefan Kornelius, political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, great to see you again.
Thanks to have me.
And from Washington, D.C., Nahal Toosi, who is a foreign affairs correspondent for POLITICO. Nahal, great to have you. Well, sometimes we have weeks where there isn't a lot of foreign news, and then there are weeks like this one when every day is another big story. So let's start, I think, with probably one of the most significant, Peter, the decision by President Biden to leave Afghanistan, to remove all U.S. troops by the 20th anniversary of September 11 in September. So where did that come from, Peter? Why now this decision? And what do you think are the implications?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really interesting. But, you asked where did this come from? I mean, both you and I were back when I was a proper reporter, I covered the White House, the Obama White House, and the Afghan Review, where Joe Biden, as vice president, was pretty much the only senior leader in that circle who argued against the surge into Afghanistan for a much more light footprint counterterrorism, drone-based counterterrorism strategy. So this is not something that we probably should come as a surprise. This is something he has held dear for over a decade now. He's not a great believer in counterinsurgency strategy. But what's important to me on this one is exactly that. Look, over the last 20 years, the U.S. Army in particular, but also the military more broadly, changed the way it fought wars. We went from a Cold War era, maneuver warfare, they call it, right? You go in heavy, you kill all the bad guys, and you win the war. And senior influential generals like Dave Petraeus, like Stan McChrystal, and really influential thinkers in Washington as well, John Nagel, Fred Kagan, really changed the way the U.S. fought their wars and perceived warfare more broadly. Joe Biden has come in and said, enough already. I am no longer embracing counterinsurgency strategy as our overall view of the world. We cannot do this stuff. We cannot sustain it. And frankly, we've tried it for 20 years and it hasn't worked. I'm calling an end to it. So I think it's interesting from a policy perspective because obviously there are going to be ramifications. I mean, the argument for a counterinsurgency strategy is this is a part of the world that is very unstable. Having American troops in the region not only keeps a cap on Islamists, but also allows us to gather good intelligence in very, very important countries like neighboring Pakistan in particular. So there are reasons for it, but Biden says, look, there are other tools we can use now, 20 years on, in terms of surveillance, in terms of ISTAR, as they call it, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It thinks he can do it through technology, but most people, even including within his own administration, because the other thing I remember from my coverage 10 years ago was that even Tony Blinken, who was his national security advisor at the time when he was vice president, was in favor of the surge. So there's still people in the administration who are incredibly skeptical that this pullout is going to go smoothly. And there was a worry, and we had Bill Burns, new head of the CIA, testifying on this on the Hill this week, that U.S. capabilities in the region will be deteriorated. The risk of the Taliban in particular being resurgent and overthrowing the sitting Afghan government is a real risk. So I think we're really going to see a real test here. Biden has made a bold and certain decision. It's one he's held for 10 years, but there's going to be consequences here. And I think everyone's holding their breath to see what those are.
Stefan, often forgotten in the U.S. debate, there are a lot of non-American troops, including a lot of NATO troops. Right now, about 3 times as many NATO troops as U.S. troops in Afghanistan. And the largest contribution comes, of course, from Germany, which has been the largest contributor now for about a decade, I believe. In fact, at least a decade. You're hearing some complaints from our allies about this decision, both about the actual decision and how it came about, particularly given the president being so insistent on working together with allies. In this instance, it's not clear how much he did.
Well, indeed, it's 2 points which are striking. First, the lack of consultation, obvious, or at least what This is what the allies claim. It didn't happen. And second, the reasoning behind it. We do remember that President Trump basically threatened with the same kind of pullout not that long ago, and we're all up in arms about giving up our negotiating edge over the Taliban, by withdrawing forces, by not leaving sort of a political settlement behind, by not really giving the Afghan government the opportunity to get in a lead somehow over the Taliban. Now the Biden administration is pretty much repeating the same story. We're giving up the same edge, and now there's quiet from the Allied front. This is sort of a little bit striking and not logical. Nevertheless, on the baseline, I think the German government, German public, and most troop contributors probably are happy that this chapter in our history is coming to an end. We all see there is no military solution to it. The question is, how much victory can we claim? How much success do we leave behind? And I've been to Afghanistan a couple of times. I wrote a little book about it. I mean, there's striking success. There's striking change in this country, openness and modernization, just in Kabul especially, which we do know is different to the rest of the country. But we've never really understood the inner working, the mechanisms of Afghanistan, how the Pashtun Valley, basically the law of the tribes does govern their thinking and the way they do politics. And I do fear that we're seeing just the beginning of worse times now.
Nahal, can you shed some light on the debate inside the administration? It seems to be that there was one person who really wanted to make that decision, who's also is the person who counts, the President of the United States. But we haven't seen presidents on this kinds of issues being able to put their stamp on it, particularly when it comes to the military, which is pretty strong in the internal politics. How do you think this worked?
Yeah, basically it came down to the men in uniform, the generals, wanting to stay, wanting to continue to try to win this, and the president, who is the commander-in-chief, basically saying no. And there were debates, certainly, people kind of gamed out, people took devil's advocate positions. Jake Sullivan kind of was gaming it out on multiple levels. But at the end of the day, Biden kind of made this decision a while ago. Probably 10 years ago, and he put the Pentagon in its place to a certain extent, right? I mean, he exercised what is his right as the commander-in-chief to do. I do want to add, I agree with Stefan. There has been a lot of change in Afghanistan. Last time that I was there, I wrote a story about how there were all these universities being built in the country and established, and all because there were so many young Afghans who needed higher education. These things are happening there, and the idea that they're going to be lost essentially if the Taliban take over and revert to what they were in the 1990s, it's tragic. It is absolutely tragic for the Afghan people. And I think one thing that I would like to see more of, I certainly don't know that they have a plan right now, is what the Americans and the Europeans and others plan to do when it comes to engaging what's likely to be a Taliban-infused, if not a Taliban-controlled Afghan government in the future. Are we going to deal with them? Are we going to have diplomatic relations? How are we going to condition our aid money, for instance? I mean, what are we going to do to make the Taliban, be more responsible and more progressive when it comes to things like women's rights and other things going forward? I don't know that they have a plan. And that, I think, would also be very alarming to a lot of people who live there.
If I could just jump on Nahal's first point, which is this Biden versus generals thing, because that to me is really, really intriguing. And if you remember, Obama for years lamented the fact that he felt he got boxed in by the generals on this. He basically got outmaneuvered. He wanted to pull out, but he was convinced to go with conditions-based withdrawal, which is code word for the generals decide whenever. And Trump also got boxed in, right? I mean, he wanted out, and his Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, basically slow rolled him for 4 years until he left, and then the Joint Chiefs slow rolled him. Biden, not only having been vice president, but also having been chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee for a top Democrat anyway for over a decade, he knows how these battles are fought. He was not going to go for conditions-based anymore because he knew that handed the generals too much power. And it's pretty remarkable that he has stood up to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to the head of CENTCOM, and said, no more, no more. And I do share both Stefan and Nahal's concern about what this means for Afghanistan. My first trip was, gosh, shortly after the invasion, again, 20 years ago. Is that possible? And the changes have been amazing, but they will at risk of completely being lost in a matter of days, months, years, because we know the Afghan military is not capable, despite decades of trying to train them, of sustaining any offensive against the Taliban. So, as Nahal said, we are going to see a Taliban infused, at the very least, government, which is exactly what we were trying to prevent for most of the last 20 years. It's going to be a stark reality to watch, and it could come back to bite President Biden, I think, in very bad ways.
Well, it's good to remember that, of course, when President Obama pulled the troops out of Iraq, within short order, negative changes, ISIS emerged and created a caliphate that required us to go back in. And by the way, we're still there.
And remember who was in charge of that, who was deputized by President Obama to run that? Vice President Joe Biden. So, I mean, he has that experience under him as well.
So hopefully, yes, Stefan, please.
Okay, just one brief lesson which I want to throw in. Remember the Kosovo War, if somebody does? I mean, that's in 1997. German troops are still there, and it's benefiting to the whole region. So it might take a while.
And U.S. troops are there too. Probably it's still a NATO operation.
I didn't know.
Yeah, no, it's so. I mean, the interesting thing, and in part this debate that Peter pointed out between the counterinsurgency and the counterterrorism, that's a debate from 10 years ago, because the debate really is now about can you with a small presence maintain the gains or not? And that's a very different debate. That's a Kosovo debate where it's frankly an old South Korea debate. It's a Germany and Japan debate, but we don't have, for some interesting reason, that hasn't been part of the calculation that for a very small investment, you can actually maintain the gains that all of you talked about. We'll be watching the space at World Review for the next few weeks, of course, and months. But let's move on, Stefan, to another big issue, which is the Russian troop buildup in Ukraine. And it's quite remarkable that this week, the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense both decided that they needed to go to Brussels to not only talk about Afghanistan, but also to talk with allies about Ukraine. And it seems to me there's more consultation there. What do you hear that was happening? And is there an emerging consensus among the United States and its European partners on what to do with regard to Ukraine?
Honestly, I don't see much consensus on action in Ukraine right now. There's a political consensus. I mean, it's widely condemned, and Russia is reprimanded for what it's doing, provocations, and the fear it's spreading. Ukraine itself is at the brink of nervous collapse right now. This is really threatening. However, most analysts, which are closer to the front, to the scene, and do interpret the Russian moves as being mostly symbolic and political, simply for the result we now saw that President Biden was offering direct talks with President Putin. This is a big prize for President Putin. He's not only called a killer, but he's also not taken serious as a negotiator. And so he's slowly crawling back to the sea, on the stage. For that reason, he might have sent 40,000 or something troops to the border. Nevertheless, we saw those changes prior to Crimea as well. And so there's a lasting fear something might happen out of the blue. Europe is very fast divided over how to react on this again. While the Chancellor was on the phone to Putin, and there were bilateral consultations also with President Biden on how to react, but the ultimate sort of answer by NATO will definitely not happen. NATO is unified on its political direction, but definitely not on military directions. And so the big question is, will we help Ukraine to defend itself, to weaponize itself in a way that Russia will this time pay a bigger price than in Crimea? And certainly the state of the Ukrainian army will give the Russians a second thought that this is not that easy a thing to accomplish this time. So my guess, yes, we are seeing a political sort of muscle game, or it's a muscle wrenching, and this will cool down. But it very much depends now on the U.S. administration's direct approach to Russia.
Nahal, if the movement of the troops are in part to sort of, chest bumping and showing how strong we are and sending a signal that Russia in general and Putin in particular need to be taken seriously, and in some ways testing not only Kiev but Washington, and seeing what Biden is going to do in response. Biden had an answer yesterday in some ways, both in his phone call, but then yesterday in the political statements on sanctions. And how do you see this? What's the strategy that the United States is putting together of being strong and being willing to talk at the same time?
Well, I'm definitely not the expert on this, but I did talk to Mike McFaul yesterday, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. It was in our Q&A in our Global Translations newsletter, which I recommend everyone sign up for. But basically, he mentioned a couple of things. He said, this could be, first of all, he hopes that Putin doesn't want to escalate the war. He gets the sense that the Biden administration wants to kind of, do this sanction thing and hope to put Russia aside so that it can focus on China. He doesn't think that's going to work. He thinks Putin is going to continue to make moves that are going to force the Biden administration to react in some ways. There have been the news about the javelins that the U.S. has given or sold to Ukraine being now out of the warehouses and it's in use, and that might have been a trigger. He also mentioned a couple of other things. He said that, as you kind of mentioned, President Putin seems to be really annoyed with President Zelensky in Ukraine because, in part, Zelensky has been cracking down on oligarchs who are close to Putin, like Viktor Medvedchuk, I hope I'm saying that right, who owns some TV stations that have been channels that have been banned right now by Zelensky because of the Putin connection. And then he also said something, and he actually was citing Bill Burns in this. He said that it's sort of called station identification. Vladimir Putin is trying to remind us that he's there, and it's a form of getting attention. Now, whether it requires moving tens of thousands of troops, it seems a bit much, but it could be. It doesn't have to be one thing. It can be all of these things, right? So it's really important to remember that there could be multiple reasons and many variables into why this is happening. And as far as the Biden administration, I actually think, like Ambassador McFaul, like they really, really would like to focus on China, and they are, but they're going to keep having to deal with Russia.
Peter, your sound is kind of weird. Yeah. Let's try. No.
Sounds like Mickey Mouse, or.
You may need to just pull out your microphone wire out and just talk into the computer and see if that works. But because you sound like Mickey Mouse, and we know you sound a lot better than that in real life, Peter.
Nothing I say is particularly interesting anyway. Is that any better? Okay.
Yeah, now you're there.
All right. This very important point, which we've all waited for now, which I've now have the build up. I was just going to make the point that I have been surprised at the lack of more. I mean, it may be true what McFaul is saying that they want to deal with China. That's the bigger issue here. But again, I remember from the early days of the Obama administration in which Obama basically wanted to make the reset with Russia and didn't kind of really care about Ukraine and Georgia. I mean, I was on a trip with Biden back then to Kiev and Tbilisi, where he was sort of sent there to saying, we're paying attention to you, but the big event is in Moscow. And I could feel, I knew that there was tensions between Obama and Biden in this, because Biden, as again a member of the Senate, he flew to Tbilisi. I mean, he believed that, again, as part of his democracy promotion and human rights, he believed that it is American duty to stand with these allies in Kiev and Tbilisi. And I'm a bit surprised we haven't seen a visit from Blinken to Kiev to show support or more vocal support for the Ukrainians on this one, because it has been part of the rhetoric going into the administration that they were going to stand for human rights and democracy promotion against the forces of authoritarianism, and they kind of haven't lived up to it. And so I'll be interesting to watch this. I think McFaul is right in that they're not going to make this go away. They're not going to go away. I think Putin is testing Biden here. And I wonder, and I hate to even raise this, but I wonder to what extent the hangover of the Hunter Biden quote unquote scandal, in which everything about Ukrainian politics has now metastasized into some US related scandal, whether that is making them shy about engaging on this. I hope it's not the case. I hope it's not the case. I think it's too important for this to become sort of mired in some crazy conspiratorial domestic US political stuff. But I do worry that there may be a reluctance of the administration to really engage with Zelensky because of hangovers from the 2020 election.
Stefan, and I think that's an excellent point, Peter, on the hangover. But thinking geopolitically, if the Biden administration really wants to focus on China, and frankly, most of the Europeans want to focus on China, they have this thing with Russia right at their doorstep, and there is this question of the interconnectedness between these two. In one sense, the Russians are challenging Ukraine and sort of saying, okay, are you really serious about potentially protecting Ukraine? The Chinese, in the same time, are challenging Taiwan and saying, to the US, are you really serious there? Do you see some either coordination or Putin and Xi playing off each other? And how are allies reacting to that possibility?
Well, they are playing this according to the same pattern. It's the same denominator we're talking about. The Chinese are probably a bit more sophisticated in how they sort of more long-term thinking and how they go for it. But I think the Biden administration simply cannot afford to be simply focusing on China on this. This is playing according patterns. Actually, it's interlinked, and the talk in Moscow is of the Eurasian Russia we are seeing here, the new linkage with China. It's the old threat. I don't think it will materialize because Putin knows very well that the bigger beast sits in the east, not in the west, and that Russia in the end is a European nation. But nevertheless, Europe hasn't got the key to solve the Russian problem on its own, and Putin's move in Ukraine pretty much shows that he is forcing the US to show its presence, to show its determination. US cannot simply afford to be not a European power in this. Quite honestly, both are united in one goal, and this is a systemic one. This is uniting us again very much. It's about how we are governed, how we think, how democracy works. Putin is trying to split the European Union. China is doing the same, actually. China is investing, for example, in the huge university project in Hungary right now. And you remember that there was this big Western university trying to get foothold in Hungary. We see the whole problem with the debt problem with Montenegro, where the European Union now is picking up the pieces China left behind. So there is a huge, huge concern that both nations are splitting us, driving us apart, making us weaker. And in the end, I think if we agree on this joint denominator that this is about a systemic challenge, then we can easily find common ground.
Hey, Stefan, can I just ask you on that point? Because it's a really good point. Because I remember from the first Ukraine crisis, you had sort of the Poles, the Baltics, crying bloody murder, and you kind of had the French and the Italians saying, "Oh, is it really that bad? We want to do business with the Russians." And it was Merkel who said, "No, we are going to impose sanctions. We are going to take a hard line with this." And once Merkel decided, everyone else fell in line. The big difference now, of course, is Merkel is about to go out the door. CDU is incredibly weakened. To what extent is the difficulty of the West to come up with a response because of a weakened Merkel and a weakened Germany right now?
Well, it'll be huge, and even Merkel, I think, is not really at the task. At least not with China right now. The way she handled China, mostly economically, was sort of is lacking behind actuality. Xi Jinping is right in another trip, and we're seeing German policy now slowly catching up towards Eastern Asia, but also towards Russia. Nord Stream is a different pair of boots here, and we probably should talk in depth about it. Many arguments to say, but nevertheless, yes, you will see a weakened Germany at least for the next 6 to 10 months or 12 months, and then right after that there will be a French presidential elections. So don't count on any major voice from Europe making us speak united here in this part of the world.
Well, we'll get back to the succession issue and Merkel in a minute, but in the meantime, just picking up on Stefan's last point, Nahal, the one place where the Europeans are trying to make some progress diplomatically, of course, is on Iran. and in Vienna, the EU3, Germany and France and the UK, completely united, are trying to coax the United States back into the Iran deal and keeping Iran from completely abandoning that deal. The talks were restarted yesterday after some fireworks, and I think that's the right word, around Natanz over the weekend, putting the talks in doubt. Where do you see what do you see this happening right now? Do you see any prospect of the Europeans who are leading this effort to get the two sides to come together succeeding? And what will it take?
So yeah, I think the fact that the US and Iran are back in Vienna, still talking to the Europeans today after a weekend attack on an Iranian nuclear facility that was blamed on Israel and basically credited to Israel, and Iran's decision to, as a result, enrich uranium up to 60%. Like, these things are happening, yet both sides are still want to talk. And that, I think, is, a sign that this does have potential to go forward, despite what you're hearing from whether it's the supreme leader in Iran or whether it's the Americans questioning the quote unquote seriousness of the Iranians. They're still talking. And that's really, really important. And, there is this idea that the Iranian election calendar with presidential elections coming up in June, might have a derailing effect on this. But it's also important to remember that the supreme leader in Iran, who is not elected by the people, he's the one who really has the final say. And if he wants the talks to continue, they're continuing. And so even when he yesterday says these critical comments about what the Americans are offering, he nonetheless, he indicates that the talks need to go on. So yeah, I think the Europeans actually have a lot to work with. My sources in the Biden administration indicate to me very, very carefully that they are not thrilled about what happened, with the explosion blamed on Israel, but they also want to keep talking. And at the same time, their real frustration about these acts of sabotage is that it makes the Iranians try to accelerate their program and also try to find better ways to disguise and hide it, right? So they're going to use newer types of centrifuges versus what was destroyed the other day. Now they're going to probably find a way to dig deeper and bury more of these facilities underground. Now, again, if you come to a deal, that might all stop. But the idea generally is within the administration is these types of acts of sabotage, they only put Iran back maybe a few months. And, whereas if you have a deal, you have a much longer lasting arrangement with inspections. And so there's some frustration.
Nahal, can I ask you, because you rightfully say attributed to Israel, but I've been struck by the brazenness of this. I mean, normally the Israelis go out of the way to try to hide their fingerprints, but they were been briefing the press off the record, the Israeli press off the record on this. And it just strikes me that Netanyahu has decided he doesn't seem to care about his allies in Washington when it's a Democrat. I mean, he and Obama famously hated each other. He almost openly campaigned for Mitt Romney and then Donald Trump. He has this love affair with Trump for 4 years, and his first act is to just, go against all American wishes. It sounds like, as you say, the administration was not consulted on anything the Israelis were doing in Natanz, which normally in the good old days, the Israelis didn't do that kind of stuff until they got backing from the Americans. I'm just wondering, you were all concerned of Netanyahu as basically a free radical, sort of unchained by his concerns about his good old allies back in Washington, just going all out to try to scupper this no matter what.
I think Netanyahu also sort of has a love affair with staying in power because he has all of these legal problems. And so he's doing what he feels will appeal to the base in the country that can keep him as prime minister. So, I mean, that's also a part of it. He and Biden have had a decades-long relationship. Joe Biden has said, even though I disagree with you, Bibi, I love you. They do get along, but I do think that both are very much making it clear that, they're going to put their own national or personal interests first when it comes to this Iran stuff. And so, Netanyahu just a few days ago made a speech in which he told the US, we are not going to be bound by this nuclear deal. And he essentially forecast this attack that was about to come. So look, I don't think they're going to agree on that. One caveat, though, I will say is that even under Biden, it's pretty clear to me that the U.S. is not going to just get back into the deal if they feel the conditions aren't what ideal for them. Like, they're actually, including under Biden, they're kind of fine with this ongoing maximum pressure that Trump put on Iran. They can live with this if they have to. If they don't see that the Iranians are doing what they want when it comes to returning to the Iran nuclear deal, I think this administration will be perfectly fine with, not resurrecting that deal at all.
I've been struck by that. Even Jake Sullivan, who obviously negotiated the original deal under Obama, I've been really struck by how hardline his rhetoric has been since becoming National Security Advisor. It's been interesting to watch. Jake
is more conservative than a lot of people realize.
But Stefan, of course, the Europeans do want this deal to come back. It actually started with the European diplomatic initiative. They way back in the early 2000s, led by the three countries that are still leading now, with the European Union as a sort of convener. How do they see the events of the past week? They made this big push to get to both sides to talk, and they had progress. In fact, they even had progress yesterday. But how do they see this moving in the right direction? And you're still muted.
Sorry, it's the first time. Well, they had this success in having negotiations starting again in Vienna. That was quite something. What Europeans now really lack is the anchor man or anchor woman, which Helga Schmidt used to be in the previous EU administration. There is not a clear heavyweight on the European side leading to what kind of success. And there is huge doubt about the goal of those negotiations. As Peter and I'll rightly say, this is a floating pattern right now. And there might be speculation that the Israeli unpredictability is driving the Iranians even towards us in search for some kind of benefiting agreement. That might be a calculation, but I think we're far too early in the process. The elections in Iran are the primary thing to watch now. And I was just struck by the fact that Foreign Minister Zarif was announcing or was sort of hinting at him running in those elections, and which opens up a wide spectrum on well, there are some liberals or moderates left who might have a chance in Iran. I think the Europeans and Americans are not seeing eye to eye yet. They haven't really hammered out a joint strategy, but at least they're talking. And this is sort of in old-fashioned diplomatic thinking, quite a success.
It's interesting, Stefan, your point about a lack of a heavyweight in Brussels on this. I mean, this comes at a time that, oh boy, has the EU just had a horrible couple of months on the foreign stage. I mean, first of all, Joseph Borrell goes to Moscow and gets steamrolled by the Russians on everything, makes him look like a fool in Moscow by the Russian foreign minister. And then this issue in Turkey where Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen show up to have a summit with Erdogan, and there's no chair for Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, right now, at a time when the Europeans need to show strength diplomatically on Iran, it feels like they are just chaotic. And I have old sources still back in Brussels who are just completely embarrassed about the way the EEAS, the diplomatic corps in Brussels, has handled a lot of the recent events.
It's even getting worse. Von der Leyen was invited for the 30th anniversary of the Ukraine for a ceremony this summer, and she rejected that invitation. This is a diplomatic blunder which is unforgivable. So don't count too much on the EU institutions' foreign policy right now. But it shows, as I mentioned earlier, there's no center of gravity right now in Europe. It's lacking.
Well, that's a great segue, Stefan, to the our last topic for this week, which is the lack of a center of gravity, which, of course, Angela Merkel, 16 years long, has been providing that in a remarkable way that in some ways the big successes of in Europe have come because of her leadership. She is leaving the scene. She is a lame duck. So almost by definition, her power wanes. But in the meantime, there is growing uncertainty about who or what may succeed her, given a kind of internecine warfare among the Christian Democrats and the the rise of a third party, the Greens, to possibly win the election. What's going on in the country, and Merkel? How is Merkel not controlling this process?
Well, what's going on is a typical thing. What's going on before elections? There's a fight for power, and I think it's quite healthy and necessary. The idea that there will be a smooth transition of power to the next CDU leader is out of worldly, because the CDU is in high need of some clarification of what it wants and who is sort of best representing its path, its course. The way the party elders, the party boards, were trying to navigate through that maze of focusing orientation, policies, and so on, was just breathtakingly naive. And for months now, even her first successor as party chairwoman, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, and then her successor, Armin Laschet, both were sort of mediocre candidates, which were smoothed in by the party leaders to smooth over the problems the party has. Now, this is breaking up because the CSU, the Bavarian leader, Markus Söder, is challenging this because he knows the party base, the people, polls, everyone pretty much points to him being the proper successor. So Söder would be the most benefiting candidate for the party, but nevertheless, it's a big, not an ego fight. It's simply now a matter of who governs the conservative part of Germany. These are two alternative concepts. That the Greens, you were mentioning rightly, are coming up from behind, extremely unified, no fight at all. Two party leaders basically acting like a couple. I mean, in love, this is how you see them together. And they tell us now, well, they come out on Monday morning and tell us after their honeymoon night together or whatever, who will be the leader if chance happens and the party emerges as number one after the elections. I don't think this will happen, honestly. The Greens are at 23, 24%. The CDU is still at 31, 32. So there's the margin in between. Would have to be huge shifts. There's a lot of time to pass until the elections in September. Nevertheless, it's a striking thing to see the Greens, which we are used for remembering for party conferences where throwing eggs and paint at Joschka Fischer and others, turning into this more conservative bunch, sort of this kind of coziness, being disciplined, whether it's the CDU is infighting and self-destructive.
Stefan, can I just ask you, first of all, I gotta say, as a non-German speaker, it was good to hear you stumble over AKK's name, because I've been struggling to pronounce her name for months now. What is striking to me, as you said, is this division between the CDU and its Bavarian sister party, the CSU. And that is something that is interesting to watch. We saw that happen during the immigration crisis, where Horst Seehofer, who was the head of the CSU at the time, sort of was far more conservative than Merkel, was very critical of Merkel. And at least outside of Germany, there was this speculation about, oh gosh, could these two parties actually break apart and become two separate parties? And you do hear, I mean, if you have a CSU leader who's actually more popular, the most popular Christian Democrat, for lack of a better word, than the actual CDU, I mean, are you seeing a possibility that they run two chancellor candidates? Is there a real possibility that these two parties break apart?
No, that would be too far. I mean, there's always speculation since Franz Josef Strauss, who's long dead, and Helmut Kohl, that they could infight to an extent where they compete with each other. That's not happening. And the refugee battle they had was basically driven by the now CSU chairman, Markus Söder, who wanted to have Seehofer out of the office, and he drove him into being sort of the most aggressive and most conservative in the refugee policy. Nevertheless, there is a substantial difference in leadership style and sort of how you appeal to a votership. And yes, Germany is about to turn into also a more conservative country. I mean, the kind of policies Söder represents reminds me very much of the Austrian Chancellor Kurz and other more conservative, more sort of authoritarian type leaders. I mean, this is a big word, authoritarian. They're not authoritarian, but definitely sort of more the strong leadership type.
More populist in some ways, yeah.
More populist, yes. And this is probably something public demands is, there is some demand for that right now. The kind of liberalism, negotiative style, finding compromise style of Angela Merkel has come to an end. And if you remember, Gerhard Schröder, her predecessor, after his term in office, 2005, people were sick and tired of his fist bumping on the table and being sort of playing the masculine type. And Angela Merkel was desperately sought after change in style and substance. And now I sense that this type of acting in the in politics has come to an end, and there is some more public demand of types like Söder from Bavaria.
Now, how is this influencing the way the U.S. looks at Europe? For, of course, decades, the U.S. looked to London as the entry point into Europe. That kind of disappeared during the Brexit debate, or even before, because Obama had a very strong relationship with Merkel, and Germany emerged as sort of the new entry point. And now Germany is up in the air. The UK is out of the EU and no longer an entry point. And of course, the Biden-Johnson relationship is a little difficult. Macron is running for re-election. How, when the State Department, where you walk the corridors of power, either physically or virtually, looks at Europe and talks about this, how do they think about this? Where is their interlocutor now that Merkel is leaving the scene?
Yeah, so actually I almost never go to the State Department, which is something a little surprising to people. Well, first, I also want to say, I think more love in politics is a good thing. And that's, it's not bad to have more love in politics. But look, I think the administration basically knew coming in that even among its allies and partners, there were new faces and there's going to be new people to deal with. And I think that they are prepared to deal with whoever. I do think that, especially if Macron wins re-election, like he could stand to benefit quite a bit more if there is this, weak leadership or confused leadership in Germany and the UK being sort of on the outs. But I do think that a lot of the relationship also is not so much about US EU, but about US NATO. And when it comes to NATO, the UK still remains, a preeminent partner. So, my sense from folks in this administration is, to some degree, they're still getting their own people in line, right? I mean, they're still bringing their own officials. They're still trying to figure out their own passwords. And I think they'll just kind of deal with whoever they have to deal with at the end of the day on the other side of the pond. And, maybe even Ursula von der Leyen might be able to gain something from some of these power struggles in some of the individual countries. But.
Can I play devil's advocate on this one? Because I kind of disagree on this one. I'll again go back to my own experience from the early days of the Ukraine crisis when I was in Brussels. And senior American diplomat, can't mention the name because it's an off-the-record session, was very concerned about U.S.-German relations at the time. I may have said this on the show already. There was a lot of fallout from the disclosures from the CIA listening in on, or NSA listening on Merkel's phone calls, and there was turned out to be a CIA mole inside the German Defense Ministry that they kicked out the CIA station chief. Real big strain in relations, and the American diplomat was pushing me on, do you think that this is really going to be a watershed for German relations? And I kind of said, I don't think so. I think the Germans understand they need the Americans. And the response was, that's good. The Brits are distracted. The French are weak. We need the Germans. And it was just very telling to me that, again, for all our talk of the special relationship and how the Brits are our key ally in Europe, the Brits are irrelevant. They have become irrelevant to anything going on in Europe right now, or even globally, to be honest with you. They're so caught up in their own drama that the Americans, the closest ally they have, do not consider them a serious player on the biggest issue right now facing Europe, which is Russia. It is amazing to me. And I think the other thing that Germany brings to the table, which we can't dismiss, is in general in Europe, Germany is the key linchpin from the east to the west, right? The French in particular, I think you're right, Macron would like to be the statesman, and Sarkozy played that role when he was president, but he has a very hard time bringing on board the Poles, bringing on board the East, and it is only Merkel who can actually pull the friendship together, bring the Italians on board, and also bring the Balts and the Poles together. So I do think the Germans, without the Germans on board, I think every administration goes through this early days where we don't need the Europeans, they're old Europe, we don't really need them. And then suddenly a crisis happens, and oh God, who are our allies who can deploy troops, who have diplomatic muscle? It's always the Europeans. And I think the vacuum in Europe actually could be very, very damaging early on for a Biden administration, which needs to deal with Iran, which needs to deal with Russia, and will need a strong Germany to deal with both. So I'm a little bit more worried about this, that there's a vacuum in Germany, that a von der Leyen or even a Macron can step into that void, because I really think that Germany has become the key player in those kind of big crisis moments.
Well, and if that's the case, and I think there's no reason to believe it isn't, it actually makes it more important for the United States to be physically present and driving the process in Europe. And of course, that is hard when you don't have a lot of officials either nominated, let alone confirmed. Although Nahal broke the story yesterday about some senior assistant secretaries being nominated, including Karen Donfried, who knows Germany and Europe about as well as anybody else as the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. We will come back to leadership in Europe, leadership in Germany, Afghanistan, Iran, Ukraine, Russia, China, and so many other issues in another World Review next week. In the meantime, I want to thank Peter Spiegel, Stefan, Kornelius, and Nahal Toosi for once again enlightening all of us about what's happening in the world, why we should care about it, and what we should think about it. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to those who are watching, and we will be back next week with another version of World Review. Thank you.
Thanks.